Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Daren Orzechowski. He is the global co-head, of the global technology practice at Allen and Overy to discuss what a balanced approach to proposed AI protections, why that's needed to give the technology room to develop and grow. Daren, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Jill, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You got it. And of course, a balanced approach. This is the key to when you're thinking about adopting any kind of emerging technology. You always have the balance between getting the product to market and then keeping your system safe from a cyber perspective, risk management perspective. But this takes on a whole other level as you have to think about regulations in US legislation and so forth. So explain to us what some of the proposed regulatory items are and why you need that balanced approach.
Yeah, sure. I think a balanced approach with new technology is always important. And right now, like in our practice on the federal level, we're tracking over 70 pieces, almost 80 pieces of AI related legislation. And so when you have new technology, on one hand, you want to make sure it has room to grow. You want to make sure entrepreneurs have room to innovate. You want to make sure that people can adopt it and that it scales, right? And this is how we get the benefit of really good technology. And I say this, coming out of Silicon Valley, where we see a lot of innovation. On the other part of the discussion, we have folks that have concerns. They're worried about safety, they're worried about privacy, and they think there should be guardrails. But what we don't want to have happen, and people can differ on this, what we don't want to have happen is we don't want the regulation to come in and be too hard that it stifles innovation, because then we might lose out as a whole.
Right. And Daren, I would agree with you there. And before we drill down into some of the basic policies on different levels, overall, what do you think this should look like? Should the industry be self-regulated? Should it be government regulated? Or should it be a combination of the two?
It's probably going to be a combination of the two. I think what we've seen here is that the Biden administration got together with industry pretty early. Industry came out and said, I think we need some protections, we need some guardrails. And I think they're looking at certain things from an industry perspective that they want to have put in place. But the Biden administration, even as recently as today, we've seen they've reconvened following up on the president's previous executive order to kind of see how progress has been made to better understand what might be required and where there might need to be some room to let the technology grow.
Let's talk more about that on a federal level. What are the most basic policy stemming from the basic principles that were set forth by President Biden?
Yeah, so President Biden came out previously with a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And there's a couple of different elements to that. But when it boils down to it, it's about safety, security, and trust. And so as you see this cascade down into the different agencies, you'll see that they're following up on this in various ways, in various forms. It's even kind of come down to the state level where you see major technology states like California looking to these policies as they try to implement things on a state level.
Yeah, I also want to point out to our audience as well that if you go on allenovery.com, you'll be able to see blog posts that are quite useful in terms of background on the administration's policies. So we thank you for that, Daren. So focused on safety, security, and trust. Have the leading AI companies, have they come to the table to work on a federal level with President Biden and the bill?
Well, I think so. I mean, not necessarily with respect to any one bill, but I think policy-wise, you saw last year, a number of them met with the administration and said, their thoughts in terms of how there might be a good way to proceed here. And then from that, we saw various people in Congress introduce legislation to kind of look at how can we pick up again on safety, security, and trust. I think the industry recognizes that there have to be some guardrails. And so that's why we have the balancing act, I think, that we talked about before. Now, if we step back, Jill, if I may, looking at those various pieces of legislation that have been proposed, and pretty much all of them are in committee right now, they boil down to a number of key areas. So one key area is deep fakes and watermarking. Another important area is kids and safety for kids with respect to AI. And then I think the big one has to do with national security right now.
Well, it has been a challenge to legislate in, our government in its current form. Do you think there's enough bipartisan support to either an entire law or pieces of what you just mentioned be legislated into something that's tangible?
I think it's hard. And I think, as lawyers, we look to see what's happened previously. I think we look to what happened with privacy regulation, and I think at the federal level, it moved a little too slow. And so then what we saw was the states were jumping in saying we need regulation of some form. And as a result, we have this patchwork now of different laws in different states. And it becomes very hard for a company, if they're building a product, to kind of manage all that. The hope is here, I think, that there'll be some consistency at the federal level. The administration has gotten out ahead of it. They're still in that fact-finding, information gathering stage, talking with industry. And it would be good to have some kind of uniformity. By the way, that uniformity is not just for here in the US, it's also globally, right? So I think Europe, for example, has taken a little bit of a different approach and already, taking steps to kind of implement their own AI Act.
Yeah, well, I guess part of the challenge is because the states have so, it's so bifurcated with states having different types of laws on the books. Is it, when you think about deep fakes, when you think about content moderation, which of course falls under Section 230,
Mhm.
and that's been a challenge, right? We're talking about Web 2, we're not even talking about AI and Web 3.
Right.
Would it fall under 230 at all? Or when they're introducing new parts of policy, is it completely separate from that, something new and beyond 230? Or will there be elements in there? And I think that's really where the challenge is derived from, to your point, that it looks very different in different states.
Yeah, so I mean, Section 230 obviously gets a lot of attention when we're talking about platforms, especially sitting out here in Silicon Valley. From the legislation that we've been tracking, not as many of them are focused on 230. There are a handful that raise that issue. But for example, like when we talk about deep fakes heading into an election cycle, there's a lot of stuff that's been proposed to kind of tell viewers or users when there's something that's AI driven that's being put in front of them, so they understand who they're talking to or what the source is. There's also a lot of pieces of legislation that look at watermarking. So if I use an AI tool and I get a result back, I'd like to know what the sources were, so that maybe there's some trust and there's some truth to what the result is that's being given to me.
And of course, you have IP concerns as well, right? Who owns what? What's attributed to whom?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think when you look at AI, there's probably three components to it in a very simple way. We have the actual technology that sits in the middle where the magic happens, if you will. Then we have kind of inputs and information, data, images that are used to train up these tools. And then we have the outputs. Each of those steps has their own IP considerations. And I think we're seeing the first waves of litigation right now that are really focused on this first step with the training and what have you. Now, I know we were talking about legislation in this conversation. My feeling is the Copyright Office has asked the public for comment on what it thinks the policy and approach should be with respect to copyright infringement and a certain defense called fair use, which would relieve certain developers of liability. And that's very much ongoing. I don't think we're going to see legislation passed that's specific to IP, but what we could see is the Copyright Office give guidance, and then that'll get picked up in the litigations that are pending or subsequent litigation. So the guidance from the Copyright Office, maybe judges and litigants would look at.
Right, Daren, I'm sure we'll be tapping into your expertise for more insight on this. We appreciate it. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thank you so much.